Rakesh Sharma, who is a veteran army officer and who has commanded a corps in the Jammu and Kashmir and was in charge of this very area where we today have a tense military standoff with China. And he is very familiar with the topography and also with our dealings with the Chinese insofar as the LAC is concerned. I'm sure this will be a very interesting and insightful talk on the current issue which is agitating all of us, namely the India-China military standoff. So, Rakesh ji, if you could speak for about 45 minutes and take questions for half an hour after that. So we'll try and finish the session in about 1 hour and 15 minutes. So over to you, Rakesh ji.
Share content also. Good morning, sir. Thank you for inviting me for this session today morning. And I found the last 2 days very interesting and very informative. So I wish to and looking forward for today's discussion, sir. Now, the subject that has been given to me is analyzing India-China military face-off and strategies for the future. Much has been written and spoken about this subject in last 6 months. The central theme of my talk is that we have seriously tried to ensure good relations with China over the last 3 decades and more. But 32 years of intensive negotiations since Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi's visit to China, the agreements, the CBMs, the protocols, all have been discarded and thrown away by China. These multiple transgressions were the first time it has happened. They were also first time that there is additional forces brought into this sector. The refusal to move back is also a first. The Galwan incident was first. The bullets fired on Spangor Heights were the first. Obviously, all this is premeditated. It is well planned, and hence we have to take the events as seriously as we can because they indicate of the times to come. Now, what I wish to do is that I'll make some broad points about China. Thereafter, come to the issues of what is prevailing today in this environment, and then lastly give out some suggestions or some recommendations that I feel could proceed further on these issues. Firstly, I wish to make 4 broad points about China. First is about the rising Chinese nationalism. The Chinese nationalism in recent times has become increasingly bellicose. It has become more assertive and more aggressive. Assertive it is because China is trying to establish its influence and status on the global stage. It is aggressive in the country's militaristic and rhetorical escalation towards the neighbors. The rising nationalism creates a narrative of a newly assertive China that does not hesitate in utilizing coercion in any form and undertake focused informational offensive and challenge the liberal international order. Now, all this talk about wolf warrior diplomacy. Now, firstly, wolf warrior and diplomacy is an oxymoron. Chinese diplomats have found a resonance in this this bellicosity that they do in their talk, in their tweets, in the social media, what they write, domestically also. It is increasingly apparent that much of this, what the diplomats are doing on a foreign audience, are actually meant for an internal audience within China, because that catering for internal audience helps bring up the nationalism. This is evident by the social media support that we are getting. This is all part of growing nationalism. President Xi Jinping's China dream, which is spoken of so many times, it included establishment of socio-cultural ties and respectful relations with the neighboring countries, which he said earlier. This has been set aside. Let's accept it that the rising nationalism is an important element of the emerging narrative about a revisionist China. Second, about the territorial ambitions of the People's Republic of China. It's an irredentis China with a chip on its shoulder, rather one could say there's a boulder on its shoulder. It is driven home in China repeatedly that some parts of China were removed as course of history, like Hong Kong, Macau, Taiwan, South China Sea, the islands on the East China Sea, all has been driven home repeatedly within China. As part of the Chinese dream, they wish to reassert their territorial sovereignty. Settlement of territorial disputes that China had taken was in a different era, which they did with many countries, the era of Deng Xiaoping, when China was still hiding its strength and biding its time. The legacy of unequal treaties of the 19th century that ceded land to foreign powers has been firmly put behind. The territorial issues with India would fall as part of this wholesome narrative being created within China about territorial integrity and what Chinese people have to suffer on issues of territorial in the last century and a half. Behavior in Chinese territorial disputes is a fundamental and clear indicator that China is following revisionist foreign policies. This is a very important issue in the increasing light of China's rising power. Third is the issue of Belt and Road Initiative in South Asia. Now, it's been spoken of yesterday also and day before also. In July 2020, very interestingly, Wang Yi, the foreign minister, spoke to three foreign ministers, Nepal, Pakistan, and Iran. Why did he link Pakistan and Nepal on the issues of BRI and spoke in the same tone? It has been often stated that the CPEC, which is the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, will actually sink down in the weight of ecological issues, floods, landslides because of the high pass Punjab, because of population issues of Balochistan, etc., etc. China is actually interested largely in the mineral deposits and metallic and non-metallic in Gilgit-Baltistan, the precious metal, the diamonds, and more importantly, uranium that is taking out in Gilgit-Baltistan. I have a slide here to show Skardu. These are the hills of Skardu where intensive amount of work has been done by the Chinese to take out heavy metals from the hillsides and taken across to Skardu airfield, which has recently been enlarged and transported across to mainland. Mining in Gilgit-Baltistan is already dominated by corporations mainly from China or from host companies which are working on behalf of Pakistan Army. Pakistan has awarded illegally about 2,000 leases of Gilgit-Baltistan in mining of gold, uranium, and molybdenum, which is used in space technology in China. As it happens, as time passes, the entire POK and Gilgit-Baltistan will be inundated with Chinese managers, supervisors, and workers, many of them ex-PLA. China is also simultaneously developing the China-Nepal Economic Corridor with major infrastructural projects under the Nepal-China Trans-Himalayan Multi-Dimensional Connectivity Network. The 72-kilometer long Kerong-Kathmandu rail line will come through next year, so they are saying. And that line is being now increased up to Lumbini, which comes to nearly the foothills. There are multiple roads, 4 of them, which are already nearly constructed, and they are being brought down to Tarai Hills, which is nearly the Indo-Gangetic Plain. China, the September 2018 Protocol of Transit and Transport Agreement enables Nepal to access Chinese sea and land ports. China has allowed Nepal to use 4 open sea ports and 3 dry ports. And 3 dry ports are actually in Tibet, in Lanzhou, in Lhasa, and in Singatse, for trading with third countries. Simultaneously, there is the China-Myanmar Economic Corridor that envisages an inverted Y-shaped corridor connecting China to Kunming to Mandalay and Mandalay onwards to Yangon and Mandalay again to Kwakpiu. One can also add on the projects that are going on in Bangladesh and in Sri Lanka and in Maldives. I wish to draw attention to this G219, which has often been referred to the link between Xinjiang and Lhasa. This is about a 2,100 kilometers long road. It's a very difficult road. It is normally not used. Even people who drive on the road use oxygen masks to drive on the road. There are portions which are perpetually snow-clad, and you can be having sun in the morning, but it will start snowing in the afternoon. So, and the temperatures in portions are always minus 20, 30 degrees. So why G219 in this manner? So it is possible that the geographic barrier between China and Pakistan, China and Nepal, having been nearly flattened by the roads and the tunnels and by the railway lines which are being made across, the G219 will have a better significance of trade between Gwadar port and Nepal, which may be the shortest route than going to the eastern seaboard of China. And then there is a road being constructed, which has been token. I've shown a red line out here, which comes along from close to Gilgit and joins up through the Shaksgang Valley directly to G219, which implies that there is better way. For information, most traffic that flows between Xinjiang and Tibet doesn't go through G219. It goes along G7, which is an expressway that goes to Beijing and joins up near Xining and takes the expressway that joins Lhasa. So that's the road access. G219 now may become exclusively a BRI road linking Pakistan and Nepal. So despite many limitations, China will not allow CPEC, CNEC, and CMEC to fail, connected as they are to geopolitical ambitions of President Xi and CCP. The geographical barrier is actually being put aside. In the battle between geography and technology, Chinese technology and deep pockets will ensure this infrastructure will come through. And the fourth issue I wish to raise about China is, why does China suddenly think that it is opportune to stop hiding its strength and biding its time? What Deng Xiaoping had said. Why is it this year thinking that there is time to change the attitude? Now, the nature and manifestations of Chinese power are well known and well written about. China has the second largest nominal GDP. It will become the largest nominal GDP also in this coming decade. It will surpass the United States. It has the largest military, though listed third in the Global Firepower Index in 2020. There is an increasing military industrial complex. It has attempted to modernize PLA with new weapons, equipment, and technologies. And of course, there is a structural and doctrinal orientation. It also allocates the second largest defense budget of any in the world. In rocket forces, missiles of all kinds, cyber, electronics, space, warfare, naval forces, PLA tells us that they have made significant and credible enhancement. Now, all is not hunky-dory in China, which is also important to be understood. Despite the economies of scale, China is overwhelmed by geography with grave limitations of the first island chain. The serious global economic downturn and the COVID-19 pandemic will cause a rethink. Many of the BRI partners of China are saying that we not now want the kind of infrastructure that you have planned for development into our countries. We would much prefer to now amend the infrastructure program to what suits them, like, for example, health infrastructure. Local communities are also exhibiting anxiety of a large workforce with China. There was an instance of Pakistan army people being bashed up by Chinese workmen in Multan. That's because the effect of the local communities on employment is not being felt, because larger employment is being carried out by people being brought across from the Chinese mainland. There are fear of all kinds, dubious and scaremongering rumors in the media. In Central Asia, they keep saying the Chinese workers come to get married to the girls out there, and there is omnipresent Chinese dealings. The Chinese, despite deep pockets and apparent infrastructure growth, have yet to create any soft power or warmth of relationships and influence. President Xi in 2014 Communist Party conference had said, we should increase Chinese soft power, give a good Chinese narrative, and better communicate with Chinese managers to the world. China's authoritarian system, exemplified by its handling of Hong Kong, Tibet, and Sinha, actually negates soft power. So China has intense involvement in Southeast Asian nations on trade and BRI. It's not actually made itself very likable in Southeast Asia. By all measures, China has retained a more unpalatable, intrusive, one-party system and a top-down military approach that militates against soft power culture. Soft power culture comes through culture, political values, foreign policies with moral authority. China lacks all of them, and therefore terms like wolf warrior diplomacy, which actually militate against soft power. The PLA, in spite of his fastly modernizing military, yet seems to be experimenting all the time. Large number of military exercises have been held since 2014, bilaterally and trilaterally. They cannot compensate for actual combat. There are realistic shortcomings in war fighting and even in command in PLA. Inevitably, these will cast a shadow on PLA's ability to take on a good modern peer competitor. And hence, all this while China in militarily tends to rely on operations short of war. That is surreptitious operation. It doesn't want to get involved into proper combat. It's been argued that despite the technological advances and growing military, PLA is accused of being infected by peace disease, peacetime habits, peacetime problems, as it has not seen and participated into a war. Corruption is also endemic in PLA, and that is right up to bribes for promotions. There's also global pushback against China post-COVID-19. The disruption in supply chains caused by COVID-19 have led to predictions that international firms' production businesses are going to be relocated. There are also serious internal issues in China. Very high governance regulatory burden comes with a centralized authoritarian regime, and its constant likelihood of implosion. Without taking its significant accomplishments, the corporate debt is said to be exorbitant 300% of GDP. There is very large dependence on fuel imports and a large importer of whole range of products. They all have to navigate through first line chain. Now I come to the second part of my talk, and which is the present day state. And I'm not going to literally talk about the ambiguous borders and frontiers that we inherited from British when we got independent. Neither will I refer to again and again on the Ardagh-Johnson line of 1896 or the McDonald line of 1899 in Ladakh, or the water parting theory of the McMahon line in Northeast. Just suffice it to say that the Kundan range which you see on the horizon is what was the Johnson line, and the McDonald line went along the Karakoram Pass, along the Karakoram range, and it turns inward. Actually, it splits the excision into two parts. The foundation of the management of Eastern Ladakh are protocols and the CBMs on the line of actual control, and the four formal agreements of 1993, 1996, 2005, and 2013. The 1993 agreement on maintaining peace and stability, it predetermined that there will be no use of force or a threat of use of force, and both sides should respect and obey the line of actual control. This is despite the fact in 1993 the treaty was signed. It was hoped that the line of actual control will get delineated and demarcated in times to come. But that did not happen. Though talks began, but it actually died away in 2002. The 1996 agreement laid down CBMs, and that it was like a no war pact, dictating no use of military capability against each side, and especially within 2 kilometers of line of actual control. 2005 protocol included that if the border personnel of two sides came to face situation due to difference in the thought process on alignment of the LSE or any other reason, they shall exercise self-restraint and on coming face to face shall not use force or threaten to use force, cease their activities in the area, not advance further, and return back to bases. The 2013, the border agreement emphasized that neither side should use military capability against the other side, and the respective military strength should not be used to attack the other side. Now, with the experience of last 10 years, most of these agreements in CBMs were gradually failing over a period of time, from 2008 to 2013 to 2014, 14 Chuma, 2013 Rakinala and Y Junction and other areas, and subsequently Pegongso, and also in the areas of Doklam. So a caveat was certainly added: the two sides will not follow or tail patrols of the other side where there is no understanding of the line of actual control. It has now become absolutely clear that the LSC without demarcation and delineation was an incurably faulty and flawed concept. That's because it was not delineated or demarcated on ground and maps. The last 8 years have clearly revealed the Chinese have deliberately ensured that the ill-defined nature of the line of actual control was retained as leverage on India to undertake premeditated aggression at regular intervals with well-planned psychological campaign. The gross violations of protocol as they happened in Rakinala, Chumar, Pegongso, Demchok and Doklam, where the Chinese troops increasingly refused to fall back as events were progressing and the face-offs were prolonged. There were also fisticuffs and scuffles. Now, after 15th of June event that has happened this year in Galwan, State Councillor Wangei and Foreign Minister said that this risky act of Indian Army seriously violated the agreement reached between the two countries on the border issue and seriously violated the basic norms of international relations. Fact of the matter is that they violated, they transgressed, they came to the areas that we were already patrolling over a long period of time and refused to go back, and then say that we did not abide by agreements. This is like a kettle calling a pot black. Let me bring us all to a current situation as it is happening with 4 pointers. First, the strategic geography between India and China has clear diktats. India had had hopes that having insulated the lack of progress on demarcation and delineation of line of actual control with nearly $100 billion of trade and economic interdependence, this all will promote peace. That was the logic that India was following for a period of time. Hence, there was a thought process of appeasement and restraint being carried out on the borders since the time the LSE came into being. Last so many years, as 6 agreements, there are 15 joint working group meetings, there are 22 SR meetings, the Wuhan Spirit, the Chennai Connect, recently the 7 talks of the corps commanders. There were a number of talks at the unit, CO level, at the brigade commander level, even at the major level. Despite all these and the 4 WMCC meetings that have taken place, all are direct pointers that China, to find peace with China and attempts to resolve the imbroglio are not being successful. Peace that was sought till date on basis of appeasement and restraint exercised by India is hereafter not possible. Second, this repeated mention of 1959 line clarifies a few issues. This line is a maximalist position of China on the borders, and all the translations that Chinese were doing were attempting to reach that line. In fact, I would say PLA has been able to reach the 1959 line in the area of Hot Springs and Gogra in the Chipchow Valley. It has also been able to reach the 1959 Pegongso North Bank, which is the Finger 4. But it's not been able to reach the 1959 line which it claims in the area of Depsang Bulge, though there is transgression carried out in Depsang Bulge, and we are not able to move into the Depsang Plateau, but the 1959 line actually very comes down from the Raki and Jeevan Nalas and comes to the base of the hill line. That is, it comes very close to the DSDBO road. So he has not been able to reach the 59 line despite denying us the patrolling to the Depsang Plateau. Similarly, 1959 line has not been able to reach in the area of Demchok. Key point is also the heights occupied by us in the area of Chushul sector, which is astride the Spangur Gap on both sides of the Spangur Gap, which is the heights of Gurung and Magar Hill, Rizangla, Rechingla, and Mukpari. Now, these are actually after the event has taken place. The Chinese have released a statement that you are 4 kilometers inside their own territory, which actually implies that they are seeking up to the foothills of this portion of Kailash range. Since PLA is not at the end of its claim line of 1959, it must be deemed by us that the aggression is not finished hereafter, and that it may continue in case it is the task given to the PLA was to reach 1959 claim line. Also, it is clearer now that the status quo ante that was spoken of earlier and what we have been seeking repeatedly in the discussion is not on the table. Let me also say here that 1959 line is not acceptable to us for varied reasons. And one major reason is that it comes across to territories which we are holding in posts, as also it comes close to our road access. So 1959 line is not on the table for discussion as far as we are concerned in the present form. Third, PLA has shown deliberate, well-planned, premeditated belligerence in bringing these 2 divisions across into Ladakh before transgressing. Let me analyze these 2 divisions that he's brought into this sector. The message was clear that this was a security net brought on the borders because the Chinese were attempting to take transgressions into intrusions and occupy areas that they were not wanting to withdraw from. So these 2 divisions were the safety net that they had, or security net they had. But these 2 divisions were indeed not meant for a full conventional war, for there was no commensurate built up in the central sector or across the Yarlung Sampo, the Brahmaputra in the sector opposite Arunachal Pradesh. A limited war is feasible. And that limited war, if it takes place in any one of these sectors, will make Chinese vulnerable to our actions in other sectors. Therefore, a conventional war per se was not on the cards with the force that is brought into this area. PLA, however, did bring some armor and some infantry. Some of this was brought belligerently in September this year, which is, just last month, in a form that was aggressive and belligerent, and they came face to face with us. But on being challenged and threatened, they retreated and went back. So there is lessons to be drawn into the kind of belligerence and aggression that Chinese have been trying to show to us in these sectors. Fourth, long haul it is. PLA has indeed laid down OFC right to the forward troops and has built prefab accommodation and logistics system and established. Now, how do we make out that the OFC has been laid? Because the communication has dried away. The communication that was existing in the months of May, June, July, which we were able to hear, is now no more there. That means the forward troops and right up to the depth, OFCs has been laid. And we could see the prefab structures being carried out and a logistics systems. There is indeed a little turnover of troops which has happened in many areas, and that has been observed by troops in contact. It implies that the troops are being turned over in a period of 3 months. Now, media has already taken a call, and many analysts have taken a call that Chinese are ill-prepared for war. They are one-child norm, and then there are other issues pertaining to the Chinese troops, which is lack of experience, etc., and the conscription policy. but actually no adversary must be underestimated. And I'm sure Indian Army not underestimating the Chinese. But then there is an apparent unmilitary likeness that comes in the aggression and management troops of what PL is doing. That gives rise to some opinions on how Chinese are wanting to combat a border war, a war on the LAC. It's very premature to take a call on the military prowess of the PLA on the borders, but Indian Army is well postured and has prepared itself for the winter and thereafter. Now the gridlock is total. On Ladakh is total. The crisis between India and China seems to have hit a cul-de-sac. The statement which came out, a joint statement that came out yesterday after the 7th round of the Corps Commanders talk, obviously gives a feeling that it is more diplomatic in nature, and there has been very limited progress in discussions across on the issues there. Now we have to start thinking how to. There was a consensus statement signed between Wang Yi and our foreign minister on 10th of September last month, which I have listed out here. Now, our current approach to resolving the problem rests on the basis that we want to disengage first to a status quo ante, which implies that there should be the thought process of a standoff taking place, or a fist fight, or bullets being fired in anger, and the troops in contact must be disengaged first, and thereafter come across to the issue of status quo ante. This should be followed by de-escalation, in which additional forces inducted return to their permanent locations. Now, as the situation eases, new confidence building measures will be included as time comes as part of the statement. But this actually system is, what we have put across is entirely logical, except that the first basic issue of disengagement, there is a total stalling, and it impedes the overall process. So I think we need to have a change of tack in case we wish to negotiate further, and a 6 steps approach is what I wanted to give. First, we have to build up a common understanding that both of us, China and India, don't want a conventional war, because they well understand that we have an offensive prowess. We have proven it over history in the last 50 years that we have a prowess or undertaking conventional operations in super high altitude, and we can do so. So both of us actually must state itself that we don't want a conventional war. So credibly remove the threat of war. First, commence a de-escalation. Remove the additional forces that have come into this sector, away from this sector, take them back across to where they came from, Hotan or Urumqi. That will obviate the thought process of a conventional war. Now, we have a problem of sustaining forces in the winter. We have a problem of inducting forces because of problem of Rohtang Pass or the Rohtang axis and the Zojila axis. So we'll have to cater for certain forces which we require to hold on to balance the sector. But suffice it to say, a significant number of mutually acceptable troops can be demobilized to permanent locations. And since this is winters coming in, it should be amenable to both sides to withdraw troops in case we want to progress of de-escalation. The second major issue is to avoid skirmish. After the agreement on demobilization, both must commence the thought process of confidence building measures to reduce the trust deficit, and then thought about what are the disputed areas on the line of actual control. There could be a common listing of areas which are prone to skirmishes, which we know over a period of time always a skirmish is likely to happen. Pegongso North Bank, Chumar, Temchok, Depsang Bulge, etc. In such areas, patrolling could be carried out by a mutually acceptable pattern. Say Mondays and Wednesdays we patrol to finger 8, and Tuesdays and Wednesdays the Chinese can patrol up to finger 4. So both retain their claims, but you disengage in a manner that you doesn't carry out, or maybe there could be some areas there will be total, we can put a moratorium of patrolling in areas which are very, very difficult in this manner. So via media has to be produced for management of the line of actual control. and there has to be verifiable processes. We have a verifiable process on top of the Karakoram Pass, where the cameras are placed on either side. Both sides watch 24/7 on the cameras of any infringement being carried out in that area, and then we react to it whenever needed to be reacted. So there is a methodology already existing of verifiable mechanisms on the Karakoram Pass. Can we go ahead and do similar verifiable mechanism in the form of radars or laser equipment or cameras or video equipment which we can monitor areas of this kind? This management process will have to be based on confidence building measures. Third, the remaining steps of the long-term resolution include delineation and demarcation. It is to state here that whatever steps we take on the line of actual control, finally the confidence building measures have a life of their own. The ceasefire on the Pakistan border is existing today, but willy-nilly it is dead because there is firing continuing every day. So CBMs have a life of their own. The only way to start progressing on a long term is to start talking about delineation and demarcation of the line of actual control. Fourth, it is well understood that the boundary settlement is a complex issue, and final boundary settlement will require some give and take from both sides. China has a settled border with many countries of this kind and has settled the borders. We too, India, has had a boundary agreement with Bangladesh with some give and take which took place on the enclaves. This issue is serious and requires mobilizing national opinion and a political consensus, and is a long drawn process. Fifth, the Indo-Pacific realm. Thanks to geographic limitations of China's peculiar coastline and the difficulties they have on the geography, near inimical states along the first island chain, with total dependence that it has on maritime trade, they have serious anxieties. We need to build up our infrastructure along the coast, especially in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. We have to undertake maritime capability building in the threat of the very large navy that the Chinese have created in the course of last so many years. And last, my issue is political diplomatic initiatives and economic initiatives. Many have been taken and many are being taken. And they haven't taken up in right earnest. Good messages have flown across to the Chinese. These were also discussed yesterday in the talk given by Ambassador Kawal Sipil. And I'm not venturing into it. Just to say that we have historically a diplomatically cautious approach in saying things that we wish to say. All our statements and actions are studied globally and commented upon globally, and also by our adversary. Sometimes we need to say so. Look at the statement of Wang Yi yesterday in Malaysia when he says that Quad is equal to a mini NATO. You know, there is anxiety in the Chinese on the issue of Quad. That anxiety needs to be heightened or kept alive in some form. India has already prepared for the long haul along the border. The Indian military forces are well geared and prepared, even for an escalation to conventional war. The government has also taken economic and diplomatic steps to pressurize China and clearly conveyed that the current crisis will impact bilateral relations. Contextually, it must be stated that there is no avoidance of hard power now to allow the diplomats and politicians to deal from a pedestal of strength with a clear intent and will to use it. Indian Army, Indian Armed Forces, and the nation has its strengths, immense strengths, but our adversaries also recognize it. It's the arena that the armed forces need to create new sunrise capabilities that is as important. With that, sir, I rest my case and I'm open to questions and answers.
Thank you, General Sharma. It was a very seasoned presentation. Should have come only from someone who has dealt with these issues hands-on. And you have been, of course, following this current standoff very closely. And you have actually outlined how we can deal with China. The only problem of dealing with China and that 5 point, the new Panchil, is that China is totally untrustworthy. So on one hand, you said that all those agreements which we have signed over the years, they have become infructuous. So there is no reason or guarantee that the new agreements, if we sign new confidence building measures, etc., that will take us very far. So we don't have to be lulled by this, diplomacy and etc. And as you said, the time now is really for hard capabilities and approach. So that I think it will be very difficult to deal with China. Of course, diplomacy can come in, but it has to be backed by the hard process. And there are many things that we can do there. So now I'll open up for questions and we see now what are the questions. Okay. There's a question from Mr. Yash Singh Sisodia. How India in present times and in the pandemic situation, how can it deal better with China's expansionism and aggression? I think you have handled this question, but you could comment it a bit later. Let me just take up some more. And then there is a question from Prerna. After US sanctions against erstwhile PLA commercial enterprises, just one second, it's a long question. Why doesn't India raise concerns regarding their presence, that is the SOEs, and the China's communication construction company, etc., in its neighborhood? Then there are do you think the decision to incorporate Gilgit-Baltistan as the fifth province was taken following pressure from China? So it's bringing in Gilgit-Baltistan. Okay, you could probably take these questions and I'll go through the rest and see what are the questions you can answer.
Thank you, sir. Now, I'll start with the third question first. Gilgit-Baltistan. Have been studying Gilgit-Baltistan for some time now, and I am convinced that the Chinese interest in CPEC comes largely also from Gilgit-Baltistan. The potential of what they can exploit in Gilgit-Baltistan is tremendous. And this new road that they're making through Shaksdam Valley, connecting the Shimsal Pass and coming across and joining up with the M5, which is near Gilgit, is actually game changer. You don't have to go across to Kashgar and turn backwards. So there is a motive behind all this. And of course, they have enlarged the Skardu airfield runway to 4,500 kilometers. Now, and there's of course a SEZ coming up, which is 750-acre SEZ in Mokpandas between Gilgit and Skardu. I am also convinced, as the questioner rightly points out, that the fifth province business is a way by the Pakistanis to get around the legalities of the Chinese prospecting in that area, or even the Pakistanis prospecting in that area, of an area which is not even part of their constitution, not even part of their provincial system. So when they were wanting to do this, with this kind of prospecting, they thought any legal issues taken up in a arbitration manner in international court, there could be problems of this court. And the Pakistanis have pushed ahead and of course, this has been on from 2008 onward, when the Pakistanis first wanted to create it in province. But finally, they have done it now because this CPEC is coming through. And the second portion of the CPEC, second SEZ, which comes up in Mirpur, comes in the plains area. It's well nigh next to Chenab River. So the whole transformation, and one should be anxious that they're prospecting uranium next to Siachen Glacier. All this could have motivation. So I agree with the questioner that the fifth province business is being taken up just to resolve the legal issues of prospecting being carried out in this large manner. the local Balti people, and you hear Balti people speaking on radios for various parts of the world saying they are not permitted to go to certain areas of Gilgit-Baltistan. They have been blocked off, and it's only the Chinese that enter these areas. So this is one of the biggest game changers that is going to happen for us as a security concern, and we need to be watchful of it. Now the second issue is all the SOEs. Now this CCCC is the actual mother of all companies. Of course, it has been banned recently, which is doing work in Bangladesh. It's doing work in the new port city in Sri Lanka. So the CCCE is actually the mother engine for BRI, and it is in very large number of countries in fucking Ladakh. India does make noise about the CCC and the SOEs of the Chinese who are working in this. We ourselves are banning their work. They're getting contracts into India. But suffice it to say that how much influence can we build into it? If we say there is substantial construction being done in Sri Lanka by this company, the president of Sri Lanka says that, it's all right by us, despite of the balancing statement that he gave the other day when the Yechi was visiting him, was just that they don't mind all this. The debt trap business, it suits us and Western countries to say so. But the countries which are reeling under debt trap are not so anxious about it. And the first question about untrustworthy, you mentioned untrustworthy, sir. I absolutely agree with you, it's untrustworthy. That's why that disengagement is not possible, sir. One just cannot get around to disengage with the Chinese and the borders because of the fear that they will come and occupy it. So we have to get around the disengagement. Since there's no progress at all, we have to say first de-escalate, remove. Now, even today, they said there is a brigade, Armored Brigade in Depsang Bunch, which we have unofficially told. And then Armored Brigade in the area between Rudok and Spangur Gap. They are, and like I mentioned, sir, there was some armor which came very close to us. And I would say very, very close to us. That's a threatening posture. So which actually implies don't send them back. They are untrustworthy. That's why disengagement is not possible. That is why we must insist on de-escalation before we get on to disengagement. And the first question we said, I largely answered the question of expansionism and aggression. This is part of it. And we got to prepare for it, sir. We have to prepare for a long haul. They are not changing their attitude on international pressure or any other reason. This is a new China. This new China took its time coming up, but it's come to that spot, and we got to be prepared for it. If we have mindful of the fact that Pakistan is a lifelong adversary, so we prepared for it. Similarly, it stands up for against China. If we feel China is a long-term adversary, we have to plan and prepare for it.
Okay, thank you.
Arvind, can I ask a question?
I'll just come to you. Can you just write your question in the chat box so that I'm just going through a few questions here. How can India counter China's influence on our neighboring countries, especially Nepal and Sri Lanka?
So firstly about Nepal. I am also fortunately a Gurkha officer. Though General Soni is half Gurkha, but I am full Gurkha, sir. And I have been to Nepal and a student of Nepal for a very long time. I personally feel that we have allowed situation in Nepal to be adrift for a very long time. It has been stated by the Nepalese that we were being bossy and being big brotherly or elder brotherly, or whatever we called, for a long time. And large number of promises that we were making were either being much delayed or not being carried out. We have an excellent constituency in Nepal. We have 125,000 ex-servicemen all over the place. Of course, they don't matter so much, but they have some constituency and their families. We give 5,000 crores a year to Nepal for only paying pension to these people. And they come down and take the pension and have great merrymaking with us. We do great recruitment rallies and also, medical camps across in Nepal throughout the year. There is also, we can say cultural relationship and religious relationship, and there are 8 million Nepalese in India working without any passport or visas or work permit or whatever. There is a constituency existing here. Despite what has happened on Lipu Lake and what has happened in the legislature of Nepal, where we have they passed that the new map, etc. Despite that, we who are grassroots people in Nepal still feel that there is possibility of a rapprochement. Only thing, we have to get serious about it. President Oli, it may be, Prime Minister Oli may be is not the end all there. There are larger number of constituencies that we can take advantage of, which we need to take advantage, and then it's all possible to be done. So I think Nepal, while many people will say after the legislature's act passage, things have gone beyond it. Personally, I feel it is not beyond it. We still have the capacities to take it on in the best manner. Alternatively, these 9 Confucius institutes the Chinese have got in Nepal, and 21 study centers that the Chinese have established there, and a whole lot of flights between Chengdu and Jining and Beijing, and between Kathmandu, more flights to China than to anywhere else. We need to be cautious. Otherwise, we will be losing, if we do not take it as a challenge, we will be losing importance out there. The question of Sri Lanka. Now, Sri Lanka has invested. Sri Lanka is going a tightrope walk between India and China, because they have done, there is immense amount of investment that the Chinese have done into Sri Lanka. The Hambantota part, the port city, the development of the Colombo port, the roads being built across there. And despite that, we feel that there will be a debt burden again. The Chinese will make sure that these nations, is actually 60, 70 nations that are totally indebted to them, will not suffer for the debt. Finally, they may not get the money back here, but they want influence. The global influence is more important to them than any amount of money investment here. So we have to work with the Sri Lankans over a long period of time and get involved. We have excellent diplomatic relations and political relations with the present government, which is there in Sri Lanka, and there are good vibes coming across there. But we have to understand that they are going a tightrope walk, a balance between us and them, because no nation of the world which has got paucity of fundage will not accept a 1% interest funding being given by AIIB or other banks across there to their country to development of this infrastructure, because the nation is developing. So they say, yeah, okay, debt tomorrow, my nation develops today. So the politicians may be having myopic views, but then they are actually achieving something for their nation. It's happening in Latin America, it's happening in Africa, Central Asia, where the countries are all getting into more and more of these fundage from various banks, the 3 or 4 banks that the Chinese are actually relying on, because it suits them. So we'll have to work ourselves through, and I wish to repeat it, that with Nepal, it is still possible for us to enliven our constituency there and push ahead in many manners to make relationship. But the alternative constituency to the communist regime in Nepal is possible, and they have links with us, and we need to build on that.
Okay. There is a question whether why is that Indian Army cannot push back the Chinese now that it occupies, that is India, the Chushul Heights.
It's a good question, sir. It's a good question. It's been spoken and written of large number of times. There is a possibility of pushback in many areas where it is, we have pushed back Pak Army from Kargil Heights. It's been done here. We have history. There are units of the same vintage who fought in Kargil Heights also located in this area. To say that in a sector we cannot push back, the blockage being done in the Depsang Bulge or the Y junction is only set number of vehicles. To say that we can't push back and reoccupy the areas of petrol points, say 10, 11, 11 Alpha, 12 and 13, well, that's not true. We can do that. It can be done. It is possible to be done. And similarly, it is possible to go behind, say, finger 5 and 6 and 7. And nation has to be prepared for an escalation. It could escalate into a war. It could escalate to a different type of war. It could be projectile war, it could be cyber wars, it could be any one of these other issues. We have to be prepared for all that, then it can be done. For the purpose of saying it, there are adequate forces available now in Ladakh to undertake some operations of this kind to push back where it is necessary. Only thing is, we have to be prepared for what happens thereafter.
Okay. There's a question. What are the broad areas of the future warfare in play on both sides?
So, with China and India, see on the borders, on the territorial borders, I think Indian Army is today very, very well poised. We have war game planned and prepared for warfare on the territorial borders along from Ladakh and right up to Arunachal Pradesh. And if we there is always an advantage that can be accrued on the borders by us by being offensive in whichever areas we wish to be with the quantum of force that exists today. So to say border wars, I think border wars we may be coming as a somewhat victor. When you come across to the other forms of warfare, and of course, we also on the border fight asymmetrically. We have planned to fight asymmetrically, and we will. Any force asymmetry can also be sorted out as far as China is concerned on the borders, and we have the firepower to do so. When we say technological wars, well, then there is a work required to be undertaken by us, because finally, the Chinese have been student of the technological wars from the Iraq war times, which is in the early 90s and thereafter, and they have been focused and been stating in that form as to what has been done. If I learn from Nagorno-Karabakh, look at the way Azeri forces have been using offensive UAVs to target tanks and also electronic warfare by using against the Nagorno-Karabakh forces and also against the Armenians. And if we learn from all the other wars in the Chinese state that we are going to that end, well, then there is work required by us to be undertaken pronto. We may have the tanks and the infantry and the artillery and the missiles, but we may lack certain issues, which I mentioned in my last sentence. We need to get on to some sunrise capabilities, which we understand we are not that well off. And we need to prepare for these sunrise capabilities, which can be in the form of space. Space is so many. You've got small satellites, miniature micro satellites, which can use. So many things can happen. So we need to prepare on the technological aspects of warfare, maybe cyber, electronic warfare, or that those issues are need to be addressed by us in a more focused and serious manner.
Then there is a comment and a question. Diplomacy should now be seen to take a backseat vis-a-vis LAC. China has taken a clear choice. We must be seen to be doing the same. What are your comments?
It can't be done, sir. It cannot be done. In China, there is a confused paradigm. It is not that the foreign minister is the end all of foreign policy there. There are leading group, the foreign policy leading group in the part of CCP. There is a foreign policy commission as part of the CCP. There are the Politburo Standing Committee. The ex-foreign minister is part of the Politburo Standing Committee. There are Politburo. So there are large number of wheels on foreign policy as far as China is concerned. It's also the Central Military Commission. So they are not a simple state to deal with. So while we say diplomacy, we imply only say talking to Wang Yi, but there are multifarious ways diplomacy can work across with the Chinese, and I don't think we can play around with hard power and with the diplomacy. Both have their value, both have their status, both have their push. It is the people that we have to contact and talk to. The importance, that's why the news item saying the Indian ambassador went and met somebody in the CMC, because the CMC is an all-powerful body as far as China is concerned. So there is line, and of course he went and also met people from the foreign policy leading group. So the leading groups have got immense amount of weightage. We have to permeate into diplomacy in China on corners which are probably not so well addressed than the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The MOFA may not be the end all of foreign policy in China, and it has got tremendous amount of weightage in dealing with them. Finally, the final work on issues of delineation or demarcation or any other such issues has to be handled by the political diplomatic establishment, and we should not play one against the other. That is detrimental to our conjoined national prowess to take on adversity of this kind.
China has resolved its boundary issues with many countries. Why not in India? Why is it lingering for such a long time?
Good question, sir. Everybody who writes, the last 6 months, there are thousands of people who've written on this, and everybody has a different connotation or meaning. One thing I would state is that most of these territories that they resolved with, firstly, China has got no inkling of any rules-based order to say they resolved it with Tajikistan, and now suddenly they come up saying Pamal the area of Pamal with Tajikistan, those areas also belong to us. So any treaty that they signed, well, it is not that they etched in stone and they will not revise it and come back to it. So, it is not finished away. That is one part. Second is, those were the years of Deng Xiaoping and Hu Jintao when they were biding time and, hiding their strength, and they were sorting out treaties. We have not got anything done in the course of last 10 years. In the last decade, any one of these things sorted out. The President Xi Jinping went to China, went to United States and said, I assure you, I will not militarize the South China Sea islands. And then thereafter went about and did exactly the same. He militarized the entire lot of islands into South China Sea. So the fact is that there is the belief that he has resolved all borders and not with us is not true. It is not fixated and given. He even talks of Vladivostok belonging to him, or Siberia. So there is no guarantee about what Chinese say and what they do. The second part is that though I also wrote a chapter in a book called One Mountain, Two Tigers. Finally, the Chinese don't like the idea of one mountain and two tigers. They believe in one mountain and one tiger, which is their simile in their saying. And could be in times India could be a larger competitor of a kind, and they do not want to have a competitor right next to itself. And they want to, either they do it directly or do it through Pakistan, which is a client state, or whichever manner. So it suits them to keep the border boiling. It adjusts to them in case the border is kept active, so that we get larger and larger number of forces embroiled into the border areas and on the Pakistani border than getting involved into treaties. So I personally would say that it is a well-planned thing over a period of last 60 years by the Chinese to decide. That's why somebody said, okay, leave the border, Deng Xiaoping to Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi in 1988, leave the border issues to the next generation. Let's talk about other issues. This is their way of saying, keep the border hanging on a head like a Damocles. So,
what explains China's aggressive postures in the South China Sea, East China Sea, Taiwan, and India-China border all at the same time?
So that's the issue which I raised in the thing as to why this year, why this time. And one of the issues that I mentioned in my talk is that why has he stopped biding? Why biding time is finished, and why this is the time to show off his strength. Now, the fact is that there was a COVID issues happening in last month. Firstly, China has got an atrocious geography. It is geographically the most difficult nation of its kind, because it's boxed in from one side, starting from Russian islands across to Japan, to Taiwan, to Philippines, to Indonesia. The whole area is boxed down, and most of the countries, despite the trade that they've got, are in an inimical relationship. So their geography is atrocious. And that is why they wish to break through the first island chain, as also establish the land linkages across through Myanmar, or land linkages across through Southeast Asian countries or through Pakistan, to establish across to the high seas. So there is a the way Chinese are boxed inside that lays down the system that they wish to work in. Now, naturally, the islands that they occupied in South China Sea, not only prospecting, or there is large amount of material available there, but it's not prospecting alone. It is their desire to have they are the maximum importer nation. They import maximum goods into any country in the world. So they have to keep the sea lanes open, and they just have to go through these chain that they have to cross. So why this year is a question. Now, I would personally say that this was a time that the COVID pressure was on them. This was also a time when the Americans and the Quad was coming through. The other things were getting, the groupings were getting together against them. And the Chinese also felt that they were internally strong, which is many ways right also. They could think that their armed forces have reached a plateau, a level that whether they have reached or not is a thing combat will show. But they could feel that the armed forces have reached a plateau, a level in which they can take on many other nations. They have got the largest navy. Though this largest navy can be contended by saying largest navy not by tonnage, but by number of ships. So that's a separate issue. But they have got a very large navy. They have made armed forces. They have transformed themselves. They say we are technologically strong. And then, of course, they have made great amount of strides. It could also be that this is a time to show off, because the Chinese Communist Party that takes its 100th year. This is the 100th year starting. So maybe all these things put together, this is the right concoction to be played around at this one. Also the time when there are 100 odd nations where BRI some work is on. There are 60, 70 nations where direct work is on. So they have some kind of say in the global matters. I think if you add all this concoction together and shake it up, 2020, 2021 is the right time to test waters as to what they are all about.
Okay, what's your take on the Quad?
It's a very excellent question, sir. 2 years ago, till the time the foreign ministers met at New York, one was thinking that the Quad will flounder in times to come, because the level it retained for a very long time from 2008 or maybe largely 2016 onwards was at a joint secretary level. It was retained at a discussable level, and it did not elevate itself to a forum where there could be strong strength. But I think now Quad has taken shape. Over a period of time, especially after the belligerence shown by the Chinese, especially after the Australians have led away outside the box, that the Australians have placed themselves into the trade and tourism issues with China. And because President Trump, the trade wars started last year, so there was a possibility that arose in the form of 2019, 2020. Today, the Quad can be said to be an issue of anxiety. That's why he said yesterday in Malaysia, Kuala Lumpur, that Quad is mini NATO. Well, so be it. Even if it doesn't become mini NATO, we should say it is becoming mini NATO. We should talk on that line to say the Quad is becoming of importance. However, I add a small caveat to it. Tomorrow, when balloon goes up for war against China with India, we have to fend for ourselves. We have to plan to fight our wars ourselves and not bank on assistance from any one of the other nations. Each one of them have got its own anxieties. So we have to prepare for our own thing. Presence of American fleet in the South China Sea will make a difference. But finally, it is ours to ourselves.
Okay, so I think we'll now take the last question. Ambassador DP Shaw also wanted to come in.
Sir.
Congratulate you for an excellent presentation. You have listed the steps leading from de-escalation to delineation and demarcation of boundaries. Now, this is all assuming that the Chinese are interested in settling the issue. Suppose they have come in to teach us a lesson like in 1962 and a war breaks out. You alluded to this earlier. Now, in such a case, are we prepared to at least grab some territory on the Chinese under Chinese control, not simply as a trade-off, but to break out of the trauma of 62 war, which as a nation we have fallen into, and also impose costs? Because as long as we maintain a defensive posture, you said that disengagement is not possible, which means we will have to maintain troops at those heights and unforgiving, climate conditions indefinitely with huge costs, while they can maintain a lightly, armed garrison on the other side, knowing that we will not cross. So it is important to grab some territories to impose some costs and also use as a trade-off. Are we prepared for that?
Thank you, sir. Very interesting question. Firstly, sir, I wrote an article on VIF in which I mentioned about 3 weeks ago that this 62 mentality is in people who are born in 50s and 60s, sir. The troops on ground, and we have interacted. I commanded the corps in Ladakh. To say that anybody has any 62 mentality, I think it is it's taking issues too far. My generation can claim to say, and people elder to me can claim to say that there is a 62 issues which we carry. I have been to Razangla on top not very long ago, drove up to Razangla, saw the thing, and saw the troops who were tasked to occupy defenses in Razangla along with me when I went as commanding a corps there. There was no 62 mentality evident anywhere. So I would say that we who are intellectuals and who talk and write must not talk about 62 hereafter. 62 is not important. The trauma is finished. Capture of territory, sir. Well, let me put it this way, sir. We have planned operations in a manner that it is hold an area and strike another area. In larger measure, it means is that we would capture some territory. Now, where and what exactly and which sector is not important, but there will be some commensurate change, actions being taken by us, which will imply that there will be losses. But having said that, let me put it this way, sir, that in my analysis which I gave earlier, I was convinced that the Chinese did not come in for a conventional war because they understand that the total border on eastern Ladakh itself, and we are deployed throughout, is 826 kilometers. It is more than the border that we are occupying with Pakistan in J&K and the quantum of force there. What is he brought? He is and he doesn't have axes all over the place. He has 15 roads that come from G219 and enter into our sector, into our areas, of which only 4 to 5 can take tanks. Of the entire sector, there are only 6 areas where tanks can come. And that also are small defiles. No, Spangur Gap is 3 kilometers wide. 3 kilometers wide, both sides by held by us. He just cannot, for defensively, we are well prepared, and the quantum of force he's got, we can hold on to him and also strike him elsewhere where we have experience and trained troops. This operation, which was done on 29th, 30th, was not done one fine morning. Okay, tonight we go in. They trained for it. They practiced for it. They were there for some time. They did commensurate heights and did all these things. So all this is being simultaneously being done. So all these operations are being planned for it. So you have to say that we how much territory is not very important, but we can do something. Yes, sir, we can do something commensurate while holding on to what we are holding on. I hope I've answered you, sir. I can't go more explicit. We can discuss it separately.
Yes, okay.
Thank you, sir.
So thank you very much, General Sharma. I think you have covered a vast ground and you dealt with the strategy as well as the tactics. And I think both are extremely important. And I'm sure the participants have gained insights into the current standoff, and they would be able to discern what is going on in the media and not be misled by those discussions. So I think this was a very educative and informative talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Okay. So we now go to our next speaker. Is Dr. Uttam Sinha with us now?
Yes, sir. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes. Uttam, welcome to the VIF. We're looking forward to your talk. This is the last talk of the course, so very important. And Dr. Uttam Sinha is presently a fellow in Mohan Parikar Institute of Defense Studies and Analysis. He has, in the last decade or so, worked on issues relating to water and climate change. And his book on Indus Water Treaty is coming out shortly, unless it has already come out. I'm not very sure, but I think it's due, isn't it?
Yes, in end December.
End December. So we are all looking forward to that phase of Indus Water Treaty when it was being negotiated. So Dr. Sinha, of course, is, as I said, been working on the climate change issues for a long time. And I think this is a very important aspect now, and it is to be factored in our security calculations because this is being said that climate change is now a existential threat, and we are already seeing the manifestations in extreme weather events and so many other issues. Probably even the pandemic is somehow related with climate change. So I request Dr. Uttam Sinha to kindly make his remarks. You can make your remarks in about 45 minutes, and then this will be followed by a Q&A. Dr. Sinha.
Thank you very much, Dr. Arvind Gupta, for your kind introduction. Being the last speaker, obviously becomes challenging because the audience has listened to many aspects of security issues and other critical issues. I think none can be more significant than climate change itself. And we are living, as you all know, in times of pandemic. And we understand in many sense, the way we deal with pandemic will also be the way we deal with climate change. Of course, there's a lot to learn and understand from the pandemic, whether it is in the sphere of politics or society or economics. I think there's a great deal of lessons for us to understand. I think of the many things that the pandemic teaches us, none can be more stark, none can be more reflective than the very fundamental question, what is life and what is living? I think this is the foundation of our understanding of this crisis. And I think in the most literal sense, and if you all would recall, or if you would have read Albert Camus, the French Algerian philosopher, he said that the very meaning of life is to do things that keeps us from dying. It was a very philosophical statement, but it comes very handy in understanding the crisis today. In fact, when Camus wrote a novel in 1947 called La Peste, which was the plague, he talked about the virus spreading uncontrollably from animals to humans and ended up destroying half of the population in a fictitious place he had mentioned called Ohan, which is in the northern part of Algeria. It was regarded as one of the most important novels of the second half of the 20th century. It had a lot of philosophical meaning and understanding to it. I think what Camus was trying to tell, and which we should try to internalize today, is that we are living on the edge, or the absurd that you talked about, and we have to recognize this absurdity and deal with it quite effectively. In fact, in the philosophical sense, he also talks about the human mind and the human body being plagued by very negative thoughts that we have to also cope with. So that's another thing. Quite clearly today, the pandemic is insidiously gripping the world in a series of what I can describe as interlinked crises. You know, it is linking to a mega crisis that we have to recognize. And it holds, I think, profound lessons in the way the countries are now planning their recovery, or the recovery path that we are talking about. And in this recovery path, we have to address climate change, and it will be quite central to the recovery or the redressal that we are talking about. In fact, if you look at the accumulated risks of climate change over the last several decades, it is very similar to the risks of the pandemics. You know, both the pandemic and climate change are systemic, and they leave a trail of physical shocks which exacerbate the social and the economic. And that's clearly being seen. It's interlinked crisis that emerges. Now, physical shocks, we know, leave a very telling and lasting impact, and needs to be seriously addressed through the causes. And we must therefore pay attention to the causes. But the causes are itself very complex. And in the case of climate change, just like the pandemics, there are risk multipliers impacting the interlinked issues. For example, our infrastructure development, our healthcare, the economy, all are interlinked, and all are in some way threatening lives and livelihood. So I think this is a reality that we have to understand. The first reality, the interlinked crisis that is emerging. Now, one can have a long list of similarities between pandemics and the risk of climate change. But I think a lesson that comes and emerges very stark is that largely the world is ill-prepared, or let's say not sufficiently prepared to prevent or deal with such kind of mega crisis. And the reason is that we have failed to build resiliency in our planning process, in our developmental planning process. And therefore, we are seeing crisis being not dealt effectively or the way it should be dealt with. Now, if the pandemic, as we all say, is an inevitable outcome, climate change is more so. And the states, when they search for redressal mechanism dealing with climate change, it will become very clear that we have to shift away from short-term solutions to more long-term thinking and resiliency. And in that format, I think science, technology, innovation will all come in a big way. Also, what will be required, I think, is a changed perception on how the society and the environment should coexist. And this will determine, to a great extent, the way we are going to be prepared in the future, or the way we are going to formulate solutions to deal in what is a post-COVID world. A couple of months ago, Bill Gates had made a very interesting statement saying COVID is awful, climate change is worse. And I think that is a very underlying statement telling us very clearly, in no uncertain terms, that climate change is there to exist and we have to deal with it far more effectively. In fact, if you have read Thomas Friedman, the New York Times columnist, he described a new historical divide in which there was a world before Corona and a world after Corona, which he says. I think we live in a world today where there's a greater degree of interconnections and the world is that much more interdependent. And when you have a very interconnected and an interdependent world, it's a world also where we are meeting constantly. There is these points of inflection which will dramatically change and bring in crisis. And we have to understand these points of inflection in order to build resilient policies. I think what will emerge is a lot of unknowns, issues will emerge. And there will be a lot of what is described as unknowns, sudden crises that will emerge, which we are not prepared for. We also notice, and as the health specialists have told us, that the 21st century will be also about epidemics at a regular interval. And in the last 2 decades, we have seen various epidemics, outbreaks, SARS, H1N1, Ebola, to name a few. But what it's doing is it's also driving more talent, more intellect, more brain power into dealing with these kind of epidemics that are emerging. And I think this response through intellect, this response through the human mind, through brain power, will also be an important factor on the way we deal with climate change. A greater innovation, greater ideas, and a greater degree of readjustment as we cope with climate change in the post-COVID world. Another aspect that seems to be clearly establishing in the 21st century when we are going to cope with climate change is prevention and precaution. I think these are going to be two defining aspects of policy making exercise. We will not find a magic bullet to deal with such kind of crisis, but being preventive and precautionary will be a very important policy exercise. And that, of course, will come about through a lot of assessment, data accumulation, great deal of scientific interventions, monitoring. All these will become important components of a preventive and precautionary policy initiatives that states will be taking forth to deal with such an issue. We have to also realize, and often in the post-Cold War, we did think about states being increasingly irrelevant or government becoming increasingly irrelevant. But I think in crises like this, state and the government will be relevant, will be important, and will be that much more to deal with the issue. In some countries, we will see a greater degree of tough rules, monitoring systems, imposed discipline emerging, and I don't need to name those countries. But in a more democratic setup countries, I think they will be looking for a greater degree of interaction with the society itself. More participation of the society will emerge based on the kind of demands and the kind of challenges that common people will face. So there will be a greater degree of interaction and interface between state and government in a democratic setup with the people itself. What we describe is a more enhanced or a more emancipated participative democracy. And I don't know if you all have read King Lear or not, but it's a classic novel drama by Shakespeare, in which King Lear, talks to his blind Duke Gloucester, a good friend of his, and he asks Duke Gloucester, he's a blind man, and he asks him, how do you see the world? And the Duke says he sees it with feeling. And I think policies or interaction between states and people will have to be based on a lot of sensitivity, good feeling. And that will be an important component of how state and government will function in dealing with many of these crises. Another thing that emerges in the 21st century is to look at things in a very exponential manner. We see effects quickly doubling, quickly tripling, and we're watching it constantly on our TVs, on our mobile. We watch the numbers of infection increasing. We see the recovery rate that is also increasing. On the other hand, we look at the economy, the GDP, the interest rate, etc., etc. In climate change perspective, exponential aspects of a demography which is rising, increasing demand on the natural resources which is dwindling, will also be an important part of the way we construct our approach to climate change in an exponential manner. An ever-increasing demand with an ever-increasing demography, which will put pressure on many of the fundamental and vital resources like energy, food, water. So, in a way, in my introduction, before I come to the very nitty-gritty of the climate change issue, is to say that the pandemic presents today, with its widespread disruption, presents today a similar kind of analogy in which climate change will also have to be looked at. While the pandemic impact is gradual, what we will see is a lot of unprecedented climate onslaught emerging if we do not make or take effective climate efforts in an accelerated manner to deal with it. And I think the world today is reminded in a certain way of the parable called the tragedy of commons. more than 5 decades ago, the ecologist Garrett Harding had expressed that in a pursuit for narrow self-interest, common resources will be undermined. And he, prophetically stated that in a statement. He said, mutual coercion, mutually agreed upon. Now, obviously, we do not want a situation like this. But the tragedy of the commons is a constant reminder today in the way we would deal with climate change issues. And again, climate change, like the pandemic itself, forewarns us that there is no borderlines. There are no territories. These are less significant, if not irrelevant. And therefore, we'll have to look at a more global approach, a global view. Of course, local actions are important, national initiatives are important, but a global framework will also be important in the way we deal with climate change. The state of affairs of the Earth system, if you have to look at the Earth system today, is not particularly encouraging or optimistic. The carbon dioxide concentration is at its highest. Never before in the history of the world have we reached 412 parts per million. That's the kind of concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The temperatures have been rising between 0.2 to 0.4 degrees centigrade in the last several decades, with the current average annual temperature, which is about 1.2 degrees centigrade higher than what it was in the pre-industrial period. Now, a lot of people say that the COVID has resulted in a drop in emissions. Probably it's a drop, but we still have a huge concentration of carbon in the atmosphere, which will impose a lot of economic cost. The overall carbon in the atmosphere is still frighteningly high. I think we'll have to reflect on this and deal with it in a manner which is far more integrated and far more responsive when we shape our policies. Going back to 2015, the Paris Agreement is an important landmark for us to look at climate change in a global context. It has called for limiting the rise of global temperature to well below 2 degrees centigrade, and with a strong aim for a 1.5 degrees centigrade as a sort of upper limit. It's ambitious, but it's something that we need to bring into our policies. We have to be ambitious, we have to be strong in dealing with climate change issues, and we have to set targets that pushes us to new levels in searching for new solutions. But the world largely remains in the danger zone, I think, in such kind of circumstances. And even the modest impacts of climate change can create a great deal of instability. Climate facts continue to bring in a lot of frightening scenarios, and the way we deal with it will be very important, because nature by and large is quite uncompromising. It will hit back, it will have an impact, and it will not see borders or race or color or religion. And these are the inescapable kind of presentation and scenarios that we have in front of us. And therefore, the kind of economic choices we make, the kind of social responses that we have will be critical to understanding the impact on climate change. Let me then come and focus a bit on the idea of how do we look at it globally before I come to a more internal assessment. We all know that, and it's been well established now, that climate change is a global concern. And like many other global concerns, it requires, for sure, a global response. But multilateral processes have not really produced the required level of international cooperation. And we have seen that in the last 2 decades or so. There's a great divide that happens when we talk about climate change and the responses. Great divide between states. Perennial that exists, and drop many things, and the responses are far behind science, the scientific assessment of climate change. And therefore, the multilateral processes tends to be slow, tends to be at times inefficient and quite ineffective. And therefore, what is required in a much more global arrangement is to have more targeted features and targeted arrangements on how to deal with climate change. We're all familiar with the United Nations FCCC framework for climate change actions. That style of multilateralism which we have been accustomed to might require a greater degree of augmentation to legitimize, in a certain sense, a global climate regime. Now, the whole issue of whether this very vast, broad multilateralism is required in dealing with climate change is a debatable issue, or whether multilateralism should break into a much more limited mini-lateralism or mini groups that can look into the issue in a more progressive and transformational manner. These are the debates that are happening, and I think there's a great deal of, as you know, a profound transformation and power shifts that are also determining your multilateral negotiation. However, whether it's multilateralism or minilateralism or club formation, what is required is effective political dialogue when you talk about climate negotiation. And this can provide a more conducive environment for a greater degree of understanding and bargaining in climate change that might emerge. Many analysts also argue that the UNFCCC needs to be replaced, and a new thinking has to emerge in climate multilateralism. Now, either we have to think more in terms of smaller countries dealing with core interests that are more aligned, is something that we'll be witnessing in the global arena as we move forward. But it is determining to a great extent our global politics. Climate change is determining to a great extent the global politics, and a statement by the United Nations General Secretary Antonio Guterres last year on the UN climate action, he did say that climate change is not a problem for multilateralism. Obviously, he was emphasizing on a greater role for multilateralism, but he was saying in that same sentence, he said that while multilateralism is not the problem, climate change is the problem for all of us. And therefore, climate change offers a space and an opportunity for multilateralism to prove its value. And I think this will be a debate that will be constantly states will be engaged in the future. There are three elements which I think would require some attention on when you think about climate change in a multilateral format. Principal reason for multilateral efforts towards climate action is to avoid any environmental tipping point towards a worst case scenario and seeking solutions that make low carbon living the norm. I think that is the principal basis of any multilateral approach to climate change. It also requires a new progressive and transformational way of looking at climate change. And in that, I think there are three elements which would be quite determinant to our new understanding of climate change. We need a transition. All states and many countries around the world would need a transition towards phasing out fossil fuels and moving towards a decarbonized society. Now, in that transitions are always challenging and they can be disruptive, but we have to think of methods and means which are far more rational and practical. So this transition phase will be something to watch carefully in the coming years. The progressive climate action that I'm talking about would also require, I think, a more people-centered approach, whether it's in the field of investment, whether it's in welfare measures. I think the participation of people, which I talked about earlier, would be a prerequisite to a more progressive climate action. And therefore, all these issues of sustainable modes of transport or facilitating direct support for small and medium-sized enterprises or investing in green and social initiatives will be all very important part of people-centered approach. Also, apart from the people-centered approach, we'll have to also look at aspects of nature-based solutions. Those technologies, scientific innovation will be a critical part of the new way of looking at climate action. But I think nature-based solutions, a much forgotten, much ignored area, would have to be part of the mainstream thinking. It would need to be cost-effective, of course. It needs to draw in certain ideas from indigenous people, people from the ground, who are on the edge, who live with climate change issues, who live with risks, and thereby construct a more modern, traditional approach to certain practices that are required in dealing with climate change issues. I think the fourth part of this new climate action, I think, would be an emphasis on climate justice itself. The Prime Minister had mentioned a couple of years ago about climate justice. I think it's a very important instrument in many ways, philosophical, spiritually, even in the functional sense. Climate justice is important, and it's connected in many sense to what is defined as an equitable approach, a more inclusive approach to climate actions. And I think this will again be a critical feature of climate action. So let me just sum up the first part of my presentation, and I would say that that climate change can prove the value of collective action, no doubt, if we are to keep the temperature rise well below 2 degrees centigrade and ideally to about 1.5 degrees centigrade by the end of the century. But let me come to a more India's approach and India's understanding and India's thinking on climate change. And this comes in the backdrop of Atmanirbhar Bharat, a statement which the Prime Minister made recently. In fact, it was a clarion call, I would say, in many sense, for a new self-reliant India. Obviously, it raises the determination to turn the prevailing crisis which we are going through into a certain rational opportunity. So I think that is something quite important. It's a driver to some of our thinking, and it's much required, I would think, in times of crisis. We do need to look at certain ideas, certain drivers that can move collectively the politics and the society to deal with situations. So in many ways, I think Atmanirbhar Bharat is a vision, is a reflection of how the climate narrative can also be shaped through the fundamentals of Atmanirbhar Bharat. And I think there are three fundamentals which I have recently developed in some of my writings, giving some thoughts to it. And there are three anchors, I would think, which can drive new ways, new thinking towards climate action. One is the principle which is quite commonly stated these days, frequently stated these days, is Vasudeva Kutumbakam. That's a quite clear, fundamental aspect which does incorporate what I had said earlier, a global response. We're all very much part of the world, etc. The second anchor would be the vocal for local. I think, again, reflecting more on global initiatives, people participation, more interface with policy and the people who are directly facing the onslaught of climate change. And the third anchor, or the third element of Atmanirbhar Bharat would be resilience. I think this is a new word. It's a strong word. We've lived with the words like sustainability and sustainable development in the 20th century. But I think in the 21st century, resilience will also be a critical driver to the way we think on climate actions. And on all these three, if we join them together, Vasudeva Kutumbakam, vocal for local, and resilience, it can translate into effective actions. Of course, we need to follow it up. We need to back it with more research, with more ideas, with quantifiable numbers to hold this pillar together. But it is an idea, it is a vision that we must take it seriously, reflect upon it, and will have an enormous bearing on India's Environment Performance Index itself, which over the last many decades has been rather poor. And it's also an acknowledgement of the way we have dealt with climate change, creating new spaces for dealing with it far more effectively, moving away from the past and looking at the future when we have to acknowledge climate change crisis and deal with it in that manner. Recently, the Environment and Forest and Climate Change Ministry revised the Environment Impact Assessment of 2006. I think it rethought about development, linking it to the environment itself. Was an important document. It is still being debated. But I think the very idea of considering these kind of issues and bringing it through debate and discussions through a larger public participation is quite important. Makes us understand that while India talks about itself rising power, it cannot forget the role that it has to play on climate change issues and capturing the voice of the people or the social impact that climate change has will be important with, of course, greater degree of scientific assessment that will help decision making and that will help balancing environment with development, which is a prerequisite as we move forward in time. So let me touch upon the three anchors that I have talked about of the Atma Nirbhar Bharat, starting with Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. In a sense, if you translate it, it means one humanity, one planet. And very simply, you can understand that we have one life and this is one planet. And we need to sustain it if humanity has to exist and if it has to continue. If you don't have the planet, you don't have the humanity. So it's a very simple understanding, but it's a very strong claim for avoiding harm to the planet or the kind of non-sustainable practices of production and consumption that we have followed. I think while it is simple to understand, it has a great impact on the way we approach it. That is something that is quite important. It also, I think, demonstrates a sense of gratitude, a sense of respect for the Earth's system. Remember, the Earth gives us our daily bread, the Annadata. So if you bring in these ideas into the framework, it makes us far more sensitive to the whole issue of climate change. And India, remember, we talk about India as a great civilization with a great history, with a great culture, but India is also a great ecological civilization, and that needs to be put upfront in our understanding and our thinking. If you look at the ancient texts, many of them demonstrate a kind of a reverential attitude towards life, towards nurturing the environment around you. And I think that is something that we have to inculcate, not only in the way we evolve our lifestyle and our living, but also the way policy responds to many of these issues, nurturing it. And therefore we call it the Mother Earth. And that has been well written in the ancient texts. The whole idea of the Mother Earth is an act of goodwill and sustenance. So that is something that we have to inculcate, learn, and imbibe in the way we live in this world today. 2 decades ago, I remember, the Hindu declaration on climate change at the Parliament on world religion, which was held, I think, in Australia 2 decades ago. We made a very strong statement saying that, and if I can just read out, it's an interesting statement. It said, our beloved Earth, so touchingly looked upon as the universal mother, has nurtured mankind through millions of years of growth and evolution. Now, centuries of rapacious exploitation of the planet have caught up with us, and a radical change in our relationship is happening. So I think that is something that we need to understand and reflect upon. The whole idea of the globe is one is important and critical, and we should pay a great deal of attention to such issues. The second pillar, which I would like to reflect upon, is at the local level itself, and that we find is going to be an important part of our climate change action plan. I think the whole idea of the social welfare system that the state have to stress upon, emphasize upon, is also a reflection of how we bring in critical environmental issues in the way we evolve our policies towards the larger humanity or the people itself. And we therefore cannot forget the local initiative and the local actions. Often we see that climate change tends to be a very top-down approach to issues in dealing with it. We do therefore need to evolve a more bottom-up approach that looks into critical issues of resource efficiency with more aspects on demand management, and that brings in a greater degree of prosperity to the people without exploitation of the resources itself. So the local response, the local actions, the local thinking, the local framework would be also now an important and an integral part of policy framing on climate actions. And therefore the old adage of think globally and act locally is still relevant. It in fact becomes even more important in the times of COVID. We realize the significance of people, the significance of society, the challenges that they cope with. And remember, as I said, climate change has an interlinking effect. It can't be viewed in isolation. One issue links to another, and therefore policies, understanding, initiations will have to connect these dots. So the state and the society needs to have a greater degree of interface and friction between the two to create spaces that can effectively deal with the crisis. The whole idea of reinventing the social contract between the state and the people will be an important part of government actions in the 21st century. A couple of decades ago, we talked about post-Cold War, in which the government would play or the state would play an increasingly less role in things. I think now the government will be an important element as a kind of a platform which brings in a larger stakeholder participation. So I don't think state or the government is irrelevant in any sense, or lesser the role of the government, better would be the solution. I think a greater degree of participation, interface, and linkages between state and society would be critical in the future initiatives of climate change. And the third element, I think, is the whole issue of resilience, a word which we did not reflect upon in the earlier times of bringing in effective climate policies. But now resilience is a critical element, I think, along with sustainable development goals. How resilient is not only your society in terms of coping with climate change issues, but how resilient are the infrastructures in the future in dealing with the climate impact. We know that India is going through a phase of increasing infrastructure development. Roads, ports, railways, bridges, metro lines in cities. There are enormous activities in that sense. And all these activities will be impacted by climate change. You know, the hydrometeorological aspect of climate change in India is related to floods, excessive rainfall, etc. How these impact on the infrastructure would also be an important assessment to make. And therefore, we have to bring in not only unthinking and unplanned infrastructure, but we have to bring in infrastructure incorporating the kind of impact it will hold on against the impacts of climate change itself. And therefore, resilience will be a critical element of assessing the ways we deal with climate change issues. Also, increasingly, as India shapes its climate responses, we have to also view things as a nexus. The nexus of three critical sectors, I think, is important here. The water sector, agricultural sector and the energy sector, or the food, energy, and water, which we commonly express as. These sectors cannot be viewed in isolation anymore. You cannot view water sector as plainly an isolated sector to deal with without not focusing on agricultural practices and agricultural changes that is required in terms of efficient use of water, or in terms of reformatting our agricultural patterns and crops, for example. And these two together cannot be devoid of our energy security approach. So I think this triangulate, this nexus issue has to be incorporated far more effectively in our policy responses. The food, energy, and water, and all have an interlinking impact, I think. So that is something that we'll have to consider very strongly. And a bit, therefore, on how these sectors will evolve in the future, which I can probably take up in the question and answer section. But just to say that the sectoral approaches in an interconnected manner is an important element of that action plan. Also, part of that action plan and following upon this nexus approach would be a greater degree of interdisciplinary understanding of climate change issues. It is not just a scientific domain anymore. The science has done its bit. It has put forward its assessment in black and white. We know exactly what the impact of climate change is. There is no dispute there. From time to time, we do hear some of this hyped scientific analysis on climate change, but overall, there is an understanding that the temperatures are rising, that the impact is very visible and real, and therefore that, in some sense, is settled. And we have to use that settled analysis to understand and frame our approaches to climate action. It's not just scientific, which we now know, but a rather interdisciplinary approach which bring in various elements of scientific understanding and social science itself in dealing with climate change issues. So aspects of meteorology, aspects of seismology, atmospheric science, together with the behavioral approaches of human, the societal response, the kind of myths that prevail, all will have to fuse together. So we do need understanding the nexus of the three important sectors. We also need to understand an interdisciplinary way in which we have to deal with climate change issues. And that takes in a lot of elements and aspects of how we approach it. And I think lastly, which I have touched upon earlier, is how does policy wake up, or how does policy become important element in terms of anticipating the crisis itself. I think what COVID has told us that we were ill-prepared, underprepared, simply because we didn't really anticipate the crisis. Now, anticipating crisis is not an easy thing to do. I think it does require a whole space of knowledge to come in. And along with the space of knowledge, it also requires an adequate opportunity to understand and decipher what is going to happen or unfold in the future. It's not an easy task. Governments don't sometimes have that kind of luxury to look at these kind of futuristic assessments. But I think it's an important element now, how to anticipate risks in the near time, in the future, 5 to 10 years, and accordingly, therefore, build in policies that are resilient, that can stand up to these risks. I think that is a defining line of the pandemic, defining line of climate change issue today. So let me leave you with these thoughts and something to reflect upon. And I would look forward to answering more specific questions that you all have. Thank you.
Thank you, Uttam. I think it's been a wonderful listening to you, and you obviously have given a lot of thought to this problem. And as I was hearing, you also underlined the complexity. And though you have given some solutions, but I think all these are very difficult solutions. And if you look at the journey on climate change starting from the 70s, and the UNFCCC, etc., in the early 90s. I think it has been a journey of misses more than the hits.
Yes.
And in fact, with the COVID now, multilateralism is under tremendous pressure. And I think the tragedy of commons is going to become probably worse. Well, that's the pessimistic view.
Yes.
Of course, then there is this survival instinct and the resilience that you talked about. Maybe we can still save, but I think the situation is becoming quite bad. Let me now, there are a number of comments and questions. I will encapsulate them for you in a one word each, and then you can perhaps deal with them. And then I'll request Major Satish Chandra to make a few comments. And after that, you will answer, and then we'll finish this session. We'll not be taking any more questions because we are running short of time. So in terms of questions, one question concern is about the loss of biodiversity in various projects, including the government projects like Sagarmala, etc. So what do you have to say about that? The other question is about, just 1 second, and I've lost it somewhere. Yeah. Gone to China. So one is the biodiversity. Sorry, this chat box is playing up. Yeah. Then there is this clash between geostrategy and geopolitics and environment. And then there is a question about the rapid melting of the glaciers in the Himalaya region and how it is going to impact us. And there is also this big debate between development and the saving of the environment. So what do you have to say about that? So this you could answer, but I'll now request Ambassador Satish Chandra to make his comments, and then you can take them all together.
Am I audible?
Yes, we can hear you, sir.
Okay. Thank you very much. Uttam, as always, it was great listening to you, and many thanks for a very fine exposition. I had 3 or 4 points to make. I think what you said is absolutely correct, that in upcoming crises, the states will probably have to play a greater role. And this was a point which was made yesterday in the discussion we had earlier at VIF, where in the economic context, also it was underlined that at least for the next 2 to 3 years, we should expect the state to play a much greater role than is the norm because of the severity of the situation and the gravity of the situation. The second point, which I think is also absolutely right, which you made, is for dealing with crises like the pandemic or with climate change. A global framework is critical because this engulfs the entire globe. And really, the global solution is probably the optimal one that will have to be there within a certain framework. Also, I think your point was absolutely correct, and this is what I have felt long, is nature-based solutions must be there because these are easier on the globe and on the environment. And I think we need to modernize these and make them much more widespread than they are. These specific points that I wanted to make, in addition to what you have said, which I've underlined, is you have said that we haven't really anticipated and it is difficult to anticipate. I would like to point out that certainly in terms of climate change, this anticipation has been there. You see any number of reports over the decades which have pointed out what is going to happen. In fact, there have been movies made on some of this. So anticipation is there, and certainly in the context of the pandemic, it would interest you to know that we had envisaged this nearly 2 decades ago in the NFCS. And we had put it out in a paper that this is what could happen. And we would have a global pandemic with horrific consequences. Taiwan did the same at around the same time. Really, the difference was that Taiwan took action and put in the preventive steps, which is why Taiwan has done so excellently during the pandemic. So it is certainly in the case of climate change, we have done it, we have anticipated the problem. The problem is we are not acting on a global note. I think one of the major things, and I wanted your thoughts on this, it is embedded in what you said, I think, but you could clarify, is that we have gone into an overdrive in the world onto excessive consumerism, which is highly deleterious for the environment, and it leads to climate change because of the fuel, fossil burning, etc. So consumerism, if we could go back to a simpler way of living, which is very difficult. It is very difficult not only because it is a mindset change the world over, but also you are really hitting at employment, and it is an economic issue. But my own view is that we need to look at this very carefully so that consumerism, excessive consumerism, is really cut back upon, because getting away from fossil fuels is not possible in the foreseeable future. 20, 30 years away, yes, but immediately, no. The second point is really, which you had not touched upon, and I want you to let us have your views on this, is we had very strongly propagated the idea of the polluter pay principle. That somehow seems to have got lost. It is there, but in terms of resource transfers for the poorer nations, that is not coming through in the manner in which it should.
Yes.
And I think that needs to be revived, because developing countries are really in the soup on this issue. On the one hand, they are required to, and they would like to, like India has attempted and is doing, to really meet the more stringent standards for environmental safety and so on and so forth. But there is a resource problem and an absence of technology transfer. So these are issues which really pollute the atmosphere. And I think we need to look at that. Thank you.
Yes. Yes. Shall I respond, or shall we wait for a few more questions?
Yeah. Please answer these questions.
Okay. Thank you. I mean, thank you. As always, I think you're absolutely right, and I skipped it, or I didn't touch upon it. I think the polluters pay principle is might be a silent element of our global negotiation, but I think it's an important and critical element of the negotiation. And I think we don't, or we should not remain so silent on this. I think we do need to emphasize, as we talk about a global response, reminding. I think it's something that we have to constantly remind the developed countries about their actions and what they have done. It's an important thing. I know this seems to be very regressive in the international arena when India talks about reminding of the past, but I think it is something that needs to start with what the actions of the past has been. Remember, we as developing country, or India in particular, is a country of the future. We have to deal with many of these challenges that will emerge in the near time. And therefore our pollution, if at all, the carbon emission or the fossil part of our development is a need-based pollution. It is required for our development process is required for the alleviation of poverty, etc. I think this is a starting point which we should emphasize upon, that the pollution, the fossil fuel use is need-based for us, and it's a critical element of our development. And I think we have to link this underdevelopment that we have had for so many years to a more progressive and positive aspect of climate action itself. And the two needs to be integrated carefully when we articulate this in the international arena. I think the world has also started now looking at India beyond just being a climate denier. I think now the world understands India as a far more proactive player in the climate arena, taking initiative, setting up alliances, for example, the Solar Alliance, which is a demonstration of our understanding of the issue and the desire to take a leap forward in certain actions that is critical in dealing with it. So I'm absolutely agreeable with you about the polluters pay principle, and we have to emphasize this constantly at the global arena in our negotiation with various countries at the global platform. On the issue of glaciers rapidly melting in the Himalayan, yes, absolutely. As scientific evidences quite clearly say, and that makes India in a vulnerable climate zone because of what is happening in the Himalayas itself, the glaciers. And I think it also brings in, and if I may add here, a reconceptualization of the region itself, that is South Asia. We have often looked at it politically. We've looked at it in terms of settling boundaries, a past which has been, not very good, politics which have not been very productive. I think if you look at the region in terms of a bioregion, in terms of an ecological zone in which what happens in the Himalayas and the glaciers in the Himalayas affecting the plains of India, and also, the delta region of Bangladesh as one conception, a conception of a bioregion. I think it drives a new thinking into the region in which these kind of protections become tantamount to what is called a prosperous region that we are all striving towards, or even in the one neighborhood concept, to bring in these elements, these fundamentals of the ecosystem, the snow, water, ice, and the permafrost, along with the rivers and the lands. It becomes a new way of looking at the region itself, which is quite important to do, and I think very necessary to reconceptualize from time to time what the region is to us and how the region should develop in the future. So I think that is something that we need to, of course, insist and stress upon. Being a dominant player in the region itself, I think we have a certain role to emphasize, a new sort of ideas to create with our neighboring countries, whether it's in terms of river management, whether it's in terms of the mountain management, or whether it's in terms of the coastal management. All the three, I think, are quite integrated, go hand in hand, and it's something that we should consider strongly. On the geostrategy of environment, yes, very much. Climate change has unfortunately taken the form of a geopolitical arena to contest with. There are issues which countries use climate change as a tool or as a leverage or as an instrument to work out their larger geostrategic and geopolitical ends. I think, and what COVID tells us and pandemic tells us is that we should try to take the politics out of climate change, but it's not an easy thing. Really. Politics is very much part of climate change, as politics is very much part of water management issues between countries. So I think we have to work with politics around it rather than think about an utopian way of taking politics out or geostrategy out of it. What will requires a great deal of dialogue and understanding, patience, and an ability to deal with and articulate our positions far more effectively. I think our diplomacy in the climate change arena has gone through a sort of a learning curve. We are far more strong in our responses to some of the Western countries' ideas on the way we deal with climate change. We've had an effective diplomacy over the years. our voices are that much more heard. And this effectiveness comes through our own climate action approaches. I think we haven't waited for the world to tell us what to do. And the good thing is that we have responded through our own domestic constraints, challenges, and opportunities. And we have reflected that in the global arena. And I think that is, to me, a very effective climate diplomacy, where we insist on certain actions, we bring in our voice to the table through the actions that we take. And the National Action Plan on Climate Change, set up almost 10 years ago, and the various other bodies, Prime Minister's role itself as a leader, taking initiative, making action calls, are all very important and demonstrates India's ability to be in the platform of discussion at the global level and evolve a much more cooperative, consultative, and a partnership-oriented approach to climate issues. And I think that is a change that I see that has happened quite effectively. Loss of biodiversity, I think that is again a critical feature, and that brings me to the issue of development and ecology. They need not be seen as two different frames anymore. It's not an even and odd issue. Both need to be integrated. I think the environmental impact assessment, which the ministry brought out recently, not an easy task itself, but I think it reflects upon these elements, the challenges, the difficulties of integrating economic development and ecological protection together is something worthwhile to look at. At least there is a sense prevailing in policies now that the two have to be looked at together in a much more balanced way. And I think here the whole issue of a much more integrated approach and a much more sustainable approach seems to be building now in policies. And also the fact that the report was thrown to the public for discussions, for their inputs, for their ideas, was something quite remarkable in policy making exercise, that we bring in the voices of the people in framing policy initiatives. And we've got a wide spectrum of thoughts and views which have come in, some completely deriding this current environmental impact assessment that the ministry has put forward in a very bold manner, also suggesting how democratic the whole process is, how democracy, voices are so important in framing a more robust environmental policies. And I think biodiversity element has been critically spelled out by a number of people, especially as you open up the mining sector. The issue of biodiversity has emerged. So at least it signals to the government the sensitivity and the concerns of the people. And I said earlier, the bottom to top approach is becoming very visible and evident in the policy making exercise. And this is a positive step forward. It's not an easy task, trying to talk in the same breath, economic development, GDP growth rate, and also protecting the environment. But I think this is the challenge that India has taken, the challenge of merging the two together and having a growth that is inclusive, a growth that is sustainable, and the growth that has a wider prosperity about it. I think these were some questions which came up, which I thought I could answer. I hope I have, in the limited time, been able to express some thoughts on it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Uttam. You have answered, I think, all the questions that were raised in the chat box, and also Ambassador Satish Chandra's concerns. But I think you have really dealt with the issue in a very balanced manner. And the problem, I think, we should not shy away from saying, which is the problem is really over-exploitation of the resources due to the now a very economic model, which was really has been thrust by the West on the rest of the world, and which is based on extreme consumerism. And COVID has also now highlighted the impact of the essentiality of really relooking at some of these models. I mean, people are talking about these global supply chains. These have only increased the profit of some of the Fortune 500 companies, but really left very little for the others. So, on the other hand, you yourself mentioned ancient Indian texts, Vasudev Kutumbakam, respect and reverence for nature, and living within one's means. And I think if you look at Mahatma Gandhi, and he said that there is enough to produce for one's needs, but not for greed. I think these are the ideas which must be brought into the new multilateralism that we are now in search of. Of course, multilateralism, collective action approaches, etc., is required. But if you do not change, and this is what climate justice would have done, if we had actually focused on climate justice, and the West made sure that the climate justice was taken away from the climate change discussions. That's why the Paris Accord was a very bad compromise, and it was a regression from Kyoto Protocol and UNFCCC, etc. So when I heard you saying that people are now saying let us revise the UNFCCC and so on, I do not know what they will bring in its place. So I think the issue of resource exploitation and for profit and for geopolitics and for own self, and which is really brings tragedy to the tragedy of commons. These are still there. So I don't think we have seen fundamental changes in our thinking. So there is a lot of window dressing that goes on in climate change discussions and negotiations, but nothing much seems to be happening. And that is where I think India's approaches, which you outlined, are very important, because we are probably one country, 1.34 billion people, managed ourselves to remain intact as a democracy, though a noisy democracy, managed to keep our diversity together. And there is a lot we can, I think, contribute. So that is on that note, I want to end the session with a big thank you for bringing to the table a very important issue. So thank you very much once again, and I'm sure our participants have also benefited from your talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. So now we go into the last 15 minutes of our course, and this is really a thank you note to our speakers and the participants. But before I end the session, I would like our participants, if any of them wants to come in and wants to share their views very briefly about this 3 days series of lectures that we organized, and if they have any suggestions, etc. So maybe we can have a few comments, and we'll try and finish this in about 10 to 15 minutes. So would anybody like to come in? They should unmute themselves and introduce themselves and very briefly mention their views. The floor is open.
Sir, may I come in?
Yes, please introduce yourself.
Good afternoon, sir. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kanchana Ramanujam. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Defense and Strategic Studies, Guru Nanak College, Chennai. So first of all, I would sincerely wish to thank Team VIF for organizing such an insightful and such an informative session. I really benefited, as I'm sure all benefited a lot from this session. So 2 points I would like to raise. One is that, sir, while this session is available on YouTube, I would also request everyone, sir, to consider changing the timing, sir, because 10:30 is the prime time. We have a lot of college and other office activities. So if it could be done in the, maybe if it's convenient. Otherwise, like it is a questions. So the second point I would like to make is, like, we are saying that warfare is increasingly impacted by technologies, and technology is basically turning into a disruptor. I found that discussion missing in the entire session. So there was no discussion on how technology is impacting the current scenario. So just other than that, sir, thank you very much for this great presentation. Thank you, sir.
Thank you for your comments. Any other question or rather comment? No questions at this stage, only comments. No? Okay, I think if there are no questions, then it's a goodbye and a thank you. We had tried to organize this course around essentially 6 talks. So